Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. If you're studying for the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam, you might know about the sample questions available down here. This is just a PDF. I've got it open up in another tab here. There are 10 questions, and at the very bottom are the correct answers along with a short explanation of the correct answer. In this video, I want to go into a little bit more detail about these answers, the correct ones and the incorrect ones, so that you really understand the concepts and you're not just memorizing answers. To keep this video short-ish, I'm only going to be hitting on 4 of the questions here, but if you like this video format, let me know below in the comments and I can definitely do some more. I also have a full Cloud Practitioner exam prep course linked in the description as well, so check that out. Okay, let's get started. Coming up to question number 2, let's start there. Which AWS service would simplify the migration of a database to AWS? What do you think? Well, for this one, you can almost guess that it's something with database in the name, and you would be correct. Option B. Let's look at the Database Migration Service in a little bit more detail, and then we'll look at the other 3 answers as well. The Database Migration Service, or DMS, is what's used to move a source database to a target database, and it does this by going through an EC2 instance that has DMS installed. For example, you could have something like an Oracle database that lives on premises, and you want to migrate it to an Oracle database in AWS, in which case you'd be using the Relational Database Service for Oracle. And here you'll see that we're using the same database engine, which is Oracle on both sides. But you can also have a heterogeneous setup where the source and target are different database engines. So maybe a MySQL database that lives in RDS, and you want that to go to an Aurora database. So 2 different engines. That's fully supported. All right, so the correct answer is B, but let's briefly go over some of these other answers. I think you can actually learn a lot by looking at the other answers as well. AWS Storage Gateway. This gives you virtually unlimited storage in the cloud for your on-premises applications. This would be used in a hybrid situation where you have some things in the cloud and some things on premises. You could use this for backup and restore, or if you just want to reduce the number of things that you're storing on premises for some reason. Here you store things in S3 buckets. You can also use the Elastic Block Store, or EBS, to back up hard drives essentially. So this is not about databases, getting back to that original question. Answer C, Amazon EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud. These are your virtual servers in the cloud. If we come out to the AWS Console, navigate to EC2, you'll see there virtual servers in the cloud. And if we were to launch a new instance, you would select things like your operating system, Linux, Mac, Ubuntu, Windows, and so on. Choose things like your processor, your memory, and so on. And voila, you have your virtual server out there that you could run applications on. So this answer is not specific to databases either, although you could install database software on the instance after it's running. All right, back to our 4th option here, Amazon AppStream 2.0. What's that one all about? The use case here is for companies that have legacy desktop applications that they're still running. The applications might be running locally on everybody's desktop or laptop, maybe pulling from a database on premises or something like that. The applications are not accessible online or from a mobile device, but the company doesn't have the time or the resources to rebuild the applications in the cloud. So AppStream basically lets you import those apps into AWS without having to rewrite them. And then they stream from anywhere through a browser. So you get access online and through mobile devices, but without having to build the apps from scratch. So this one is not specific to database migration either. And going back to the original question, B is the final answer. Okay, let's scroll down to question number 4 here. Which AWS networking service enables a company to create a virtual network within AWS? Have a look at the answers and pick the one that you think is correct. The correct answer is D, Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, or VPC. This is basically your slice of the overall AWS network. There are millions of resources spread across AWS, and you want to make sure that yours are private to you. And that's what the VPC gives you. It's your own private network within the cloud that isolates your resources from everyone else's. Out to the console, if we navigate to VPC, and then VPCs, you'll see that we have one here. When you go to create your AWS account, you get a default VPC, and then of course you can create others as well. And then when you go to create an EC2 instance, for example, your virtual server, I won't go all the way through this, but if we go to launch, And then you'll see down here, under Network Settings, you're selecting the VPC, the Virtual Private Cloud, where this instance will live. And that's, again, how it's isolated from all of the other customers out in AWS. All right, so for this one, the correct answer was D. Let's take a quick look at some of these other answers to learn why they're not correct. For AWS Config, let's come into the console and navigate here. This lets you inventory and track your resources, and you can check when the configuration of something changed. This is really used for compliance and auditing, so that you have a record of what's going on with your resources. Just to briefly show you the resources or inventory of things, I'll just narrow this down to the S3 buckets that I have in my account. And you'll see them here. And then I have a rule set up that says these S3 buckets should not be open to the public. I do have some that are, actually, so those are coming in as non-compliant. But the cool thing about config is that it'll record when things change. So for example, this bucket here, config results, I originally had this open up to the public, so it was coming back as non-compliant, but then I went and changed the bucket to block all public access, and that change was recorded here. So you get a timeline, a paper trail, if you will, of all the things that changed. So on this date and time, we went from no blocked public access to blocking it, and you'll see the different events that happened here. So that's why you would use config. It's to take an inventory of your resources and to track when they change. A pretty cool service, but not the correct answer for this particular question. Moving on to Amazon Route 53. If we look at this one, this is Amazon's managed DNS service, domain name server service, that lets you register domain names, something like mycoolwebsite.com. We'll check if that's available. I'm sure it's not. No, it's unavailable, but you could purchase another domain here, assuming it's available. And you can also set up records that say, if somebody goes to mycoolwebsite.com, assuming that was your name, then the traffic should go to IP address 1.2.3.4, for example. And that's really what DNS gives you. So a user would try to navigate to, say, for example, my subdomain.amberaws.com. Obviously, we don't know what the actual IP address is where that web page lives, and that's where Route 53 comes in. So we set up Route 53 to say, oh, that's actually located at this IP address, 12.34, etc. And then the browser can say, okay, instance that lives at 12.34.56.78, I want the index.html page that you're hosting, and then the instance can return it and load that in the browser. So that's the idea behind DNS. It's to translate non-human friendly IP addresses into a domain name that us humans can remember. Moving down to AWS Direct Connect. This gives you a dedicated physical connection between your on-premises data center and AWS. As in, think physical cables, working with your utility provider to ensure that the lines connect to an AWS data center. This gives you a super fast private connection, and it doesn't go over the public internet. So really good to have, but not the correct answer for this question. Final answer was D, the virtual private cloud. All right, let's move down to question number 6 here. Which component of the AWS global infrastructure does Amazon CloudFront use to ensure low latency delivery? I'll bring you out to this page for Amazon CloudFront. CloudFront is Amazon's content delivery network, or CDN, something akin to an Akamai or Fastly. So if your site is serving up videos or images and what have you, the whole job of CloudFront is to get them to your users faster. And the way that happens is through edge locations. You'll see here on the map the edge locations are in blue. And CloudFront will store cached copies of your content, and that's how they can get to the users faster. CloudFront has a huge global network, currently over 410 points of presence. You're not going to need to know all of this for the exam, but just know that for faster delivery of content, you're using CloudFront, which utilizes edge locations. All right, back to our questions. Answer B was the correct one here. I'm going to group answers A and C into the same discussion next. Let's talk about regions and availability zones. Bringing you to another map here, the whole global infrastructure of AWS is set up with regions and availability zones. So just here in North America, you'll see the different regions. We've got one in Oregon, Northern California, the GovCloud in US West. You have others over here on the East Coast, and then a lot more throughout the world as well. You can also see these as you're working in the AWS console. So opening up a new tab, here in the console on the drop-down, these are your regions. So like we just saw in the map, we've got things in the US, we've got things in Asia, in Europe, and so on. Each region contains 2 or more availability zones, and an availability zone is just a single data center or group of data centers within a region. They each have redundant power, networking, and connectivity, and they're housed in separate facilities. So that means if there's some kind of a disaster in one data center or availability zone, then things can fail over to another that might be several miles away on separate power and so forth. But they're still close enough to each other that you have low latency and speeds between the zones. And you can see the availability zones in various places in the console, like when you go to create a new EC2 instance under your subnets, you'll see something like 2A, 2B, 2C, and so on. So pulling it all together, a region is divided into 2 or more availability zones. An availability zone corresponds to a physically isolated data center in a geographic region. All right, back to our list of answers. The last one here, D, Virtual Private Cloud. We covered this earlier in the video, so feel free to back up to that. But just as a recap, this is what lets you say, this is my little slice of the AWS network, and isolate your resources from everything else. All right, so final answer for this one was edge locations. Before we move on to the next question, if you're finding this helpful so far, I'd really appreciate you hitting that like button so it can spread to more people, and also consider subscribing for more content like this. All right, let's come down to question number 7 next. How would a system administrator add an additional layer of login security to a user's AWS Management Console? For this one, we're going to enable multi-factor authentication, or MFA. It's likely that you're using MFA every day, even if you aren't familiar with the term. You go to a website, you log in with a username and password, and then the site will say, hold on, wait just a minute, I'm going to send you a text message with a code that you then have to enter to log into the site. So basically there are 2 or more factors, that's where the name comes from, that are required to authenticate for the system to figure out who you are basically. And this could be something that you know, like a password, something that you have, like a phone or a hardware token, or something that you are, like a fingerprint. In AWS, there's 3 types of devices you can use for this mode of authentication. First is the virtual MFA device for a smartphone or tablet. You might be familiar with these apps like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, or Authy. So you have this app on your phone, you can get a code and then enter it into AWS to log in. The U2F security key, this stands for Universal Second Factor. This is a physical hardware key, like a YubiKey that you plug into your computer. And then when you're prompted, you simply touch that key and it'll enter the code that lets you log in. And then a third option is another hardware key like the Gemalto shown here. Out in the AWS console, if we navigate to IAM, Identity and Access Management, this is where you can manage your users and groups. I've got a few users set up here. Say, for example, Dwight Root. And under Security Credentials, this is where we could go set up the MFA. So here, Manage, and those different options that we talked about a second ago in the slide. All right, so correct answer is C, Enable Multi-Factor Authentication. Let's take a quick look at some of these other options though, starting with A, the Amazon Cloud Directory. If we navigate to Directory out here, and come to Directory Service. Over here on the left, you'll notice there's 2 options. There's Active Directory, and if we were to just set up a directory here, we have different options like AWS Manage Microsoft AD, Microsoft Active Directory. That's a Microsoft technology that lets you manage your users and groups and computers. We have a connector, and then there's also Cognito user pools, which is another way that you can authenticate users from another provider like Facebook or Google. So that's one option for directories. I'll just leave out of this. But then there's another one here, Cloud Directory. And this was one of the options for answers. This one is similar but slightly different. Here you can create a directory of really anything that you want. So maybe org charts, a directory of classes for a school, a directory of devices or something like that. So anything where you need to organize data into a hierarchy, you can do here in a cloud directory. So that's what this one is all about. Obviously not the correct answer, but that should give you a better idea of what cloud directory can be used for. Option B, audit the AWS Identity and Access Management roles. Let's quickly talk about what roles are. In real life, you've probably heard the expression about somebody wearing a lot of hats. In your own life, maybe you juggle different hats or roles of being a parent, or a software engineer at work, or maybe a soccer coach on the weekends, a home chef for yourself or your family, maybe a therapist for your friends. So you wear a lot of different hats, you play a lot of different roles, depending on the day or the hour. In AWS, roles are similar. You can assume a role by essentially putting on that hat. And when you put on that hat, you can do everything the role can. So maybe there's a role that says you can read from S3, you can write to CloudWatch, or you can read from a DynamoDB table. And that one role will let you do all of those things. Maybe there's another role that says you can only read from S3, or another role that says you can write to CloudWatch. So whatever hat you put on, or whatever role you assume, that's what you can do. And this example is using an EC2 instance or virtual server. But the same is true of user or group, so they can assume roles as well, and it works the same way. Temporarily, that user would be able to do whatever things the role can do. So that's the idea, a really powerful thing in AWS, but not the correct answer for this particular question. And then the last option for an answer here, enable AWS CloudTrail. CloudTrail is used to record user activity and API usage on an AWS account. APIs are basically the code that makes things happen in AWS. So if I go into the console, I create an IAM role that issues an API call. It calls the code basically to do that, and then that code will create the new role. Or if I terminate an EC2 instance, or even if I log into the AWS console, all of those actions are making API calls on the back end, and CloudTrail is logging that. So navigating to CloudTrail, and over here on the left, I'll just come into event history. I've been doing various things in this account, and so you'll see they're all logged here. I deleted a bucket, I updated the public access on a bucket, created a bucket, logged into the console. So all of these things are being tracked here in CloudTrail. All right, final answer on this question was C, to enable multi-factor authentication. Moving down to question number 8. Which service can identify the user that made the API call when an Amazon EC2 instance is terminated? We actually just covered this correct answer in the last question. It's AWS CloudTrail. Feel free to back up to that timestamp if you missed it, but CloudTrail records all the API calls that are made, and that would include things like terminating an EC2 instance. Taking a quick look at these other answers, though, AWS Trusted Advisor. Let's just take a look at that one in the console. Trusted Advisor. This is a service that will inspect your AWS environment and give you real-time recommendations based on best practices. And these best practices fall into the 5 categories you see here on the left: cost optimization, performance, security, fault tolerance, and service limits. At the moment, I don't have anything urgent that needs my attention. You will, though, see the recommended action down here to upgrade my support plan to get all of the checks. So I have the very basic support plan. I'm not going to get everything, but let's just quickly go through some of these and you'll get an idea of what it's going to recommend. So for cost optimization, you can get checks against low utilization of your instances, idle load balancers. For performance, high utilization of instances, and so on. There's a lot of things here. Suggestions around security. Some of these are enabled regardless of your support plan here. And I won't go through all of these, but the Trusted Advisor is basically meant to be just that, an advisor to tell you about different best practices and how you could implement them in your account. All right, back to our other answers here. Answer C, AWS X-Ray. I'll just open up a new tab here. We'll take a quick look at some examples. This is for developers to be able to do tracing on an application. So you can identify bottlenecks, identify errors, and just to show you some examples of what you can get here. You can do a map like this, mapping all the calls between different services, seeing how long they take, or this other screenshot here, drilling down to different requests and responses, how long they're taking, the calls that are being made, and so on. So pretty great service, but not the correct answer for our particular question. And then finally, AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM. We saw that one earlier as well. And this is where you can manage your users, your user groups, roles, policies, permissions, and that kind of thing. So not the correct answer for this one. To identify the API calls, you'll want to use CloudTrail. So that wraps it up for this video. If you like this kind of format, let me know below in the comments, and I can definitely do more of these. Also, if you want a full exam prep course for Cloud Practitioner, I've left that link in the description as well. Hopefully it helps. Thanks so much for watching.